I first met the Gulen movement, I think maybe about 2007, so it's more than 10 years ago. And it came about because a couple of your people in London were invited to my university, which was then called Leeds Beckett University, because our Vice-Chancellor, Simon Lee, was very interested in the whole concept of peace building through dialogue. And he knew about what we now think of as the Hizmet Movement and the Dialogue Society. And he invited members of the society based in London to come and talk to us in Leeds. And because I was involved in community development work and volunteering with the university, I was invited to that meeting. My first impression was, these are highly educated, charming, kind people of, in one case, people of Turkish origin, but born in London. In another case, Turks who'd settled in London, who had an enormous amount to offer our university because of its long history of community work and dialogue. And I found it enlightening myself to meet these charming, intelligent, kind people. I would never claim to be an expert in it now, but I have a much better understanding through talking to members of Hizmet. And to answer your question, yes, I did realize then that I was meeting quite a different way of thinking spiritually and acting in line with one's spiritual beliefs. Because apart from the Malcolm X followers, I hadn't really met Muslims who were interested in broader social change. And particularly what I took from Hizmet was the idea that Islam could ally itself to a modernizing project, a project not modernizing Islam, but a modernizing project of society as a whole that would embrace rationalism, would embrace scientific thought, would embrace modern philosophy, would embrace really the kind of modern progressive world that I support. So that was very enlightening for me, and that was one of the reasons why I was very happy when the university took in some of the Gulen movement young people as our PhD students and extended its own dialogue, for want of a better word, with the Dialogue Society. The encounter with the Dialogue Society has had a profound effect upon me, and it goes along with working with a group of Christians in Leeds who I became a member of their advisory group also, called Together for Peace. And they too have a model of social change based in dialogue, based in building peaceful relations across communities who might at first sight be seen to have a lot of difference. So simultaneously, but it was initiated really by meeting the Hizmet movement, I became more involved with this Christian group called Together for Peace in Leeds. I am not a believer, but I have always recognized, as I said before, I was very influenced by the civil rights movement in the United States. I've always and therefore applauded and gave huge support to Martin Luther King and the Christian-based civil rights movement in the United States. So I've always had at the back of my mind this notion of religion as a progressive force. The change that it's made in me in terms of a kind of more personality kind of change is to temper my own aggressiveness. And like a lot of leftists, I've often been a very aggressive arguer, a very kind of militant demonstrator, and I've never shied away from an aggressive form of conflict. I would like to claim that I began to temper this in my 20s, especially when I had children, because it doesn't work with children to be aggressive. So I would like to say that I had tempered my aggression before I met the Hizmet movement. But and this is why I said before that, you know, the fact that the Hizmet people were so charming and so kind in their personalities, I thought this is a very important aspect of being a human being. The aggressive and combative element, which most humans do have and I had too much of, needs to be transformed in this more contemplative and more meditative kind of way. And that's, you know, I recognize that that's what prayer does for people, and prayer circles, you know, have this effect. And I haven't gone that far, but I do now prefer to be in the company of people with whom I can have a dialogue or a discussion, which might have many points of difference in it, but it is conducted in a peaceful and respectful kind of way. Meeting the Hizmet movement really helped me move my ideas forward about the use of dialogue, the use of a respectful, conversational, reaching across difference approach to the problems of British society. So I really firmly believe that, and British society is still riven with xenophobia, with racism, with other forms of discrimination, sexism, anti-Semitism, all these pernicious undercurrents that have always unfortunately been in Britain, which we thought we were beginning to overcome in the 1960s, 1970s and 1980s. They're rearing their ugly head all over again now. And it is absolutely imperative that we develop the techniques that the Hizmet movement and others have helped us with in breaching those kinds of divisions. On the particular issue of radical Islam, radicalisation and the armed, the militarized Salafi, I'm not too worried about the peaceful Salafis, but the militarized wing of Islam. I mean, I looked at this as another reason for being attracted to Hizmet. I could see immediately that if we could have a public, progressive Islamic movement that would stand as an antidote to those people who were being drawn into this violent jihadi movement, that also would be an enormous benefit to British society. But I do think that the publications that Hizmet have made and the activities that Hizmet has undertaken are a genuine contribution to presenting this country with a version of Islam which we can all live very comfortably with. When I saw that the followers of Fethullah Gulen were being accused of attempting to overthrow the government, which I knew they'd had in recent years some differences with, but which I also knew they had been utterly supportive of the Justice Party for many years, I thought this was absolutely ridiculous and absolutely impossible that Fethullah Gulen could have instructed his supporters to launch a coup. It contradicted everything that I'd learned about the movement, everything that I'd learned about Gulen's teaching, and everything that I knew from the many Turks and by English supporters of the Hizmet movement. You know, all of those people that I knew, I was aghast at the idea that anybody might think that they would launch a coup. So it struck me initially as a fabrication, and I still think that it is. I'm still astonished that there has been such muted criticism of the complete denial of human rights of Hizmet members particularly in Turkey, but now abroad, and we're seeing abductions and all kinds of acts of terror being used by the Erdogan government against Hizmet supporters. And I'm utterly opposed to the narrative that he's presenting, and much more opposed to his denial of proper judicial processes and the closing down of legitimate organs. Any kind of democracy should be allowing the kinds of publications and media that the movement had built in Turkey. I'm steadfastly opposed to the current Turkish government's activities. It's really a difficult question for me to answer how Hizmet might survive and prosper. I am heartened by the fact that people in exile, particularly people of the caliber of the Hizmet supporters, are often extremely resourceful, often extremely committed to the position that in this case is resulting them being in exile. But they are also supported by, in most countries, Hizmet members who have settled in those other countries for work reasons or family reasons, or because the movement initially sent them to other countries to spread the good news of Gülen's message. So I think, from what I can gather from the various visits that I've made, I think there is a pretty solid infrastructure in what we might call the kind of diasporic Hizmet movement. And given the combination of the kind of spiritual strength, the intellectual strength, and of course the economic resources, because all the people that I've come across in the Hizmet movement are hardworking people who, earn a proper living and will devote some resources, financial resources, to the preservation of the movement. I think it can and it will survive. The second thing I think is that I don't believe that dictatorships in any country can survive for very long. And I do think that Erdogan is establishing a dictatorship. I think he's in a similar kind of mindset to people like Putin, people like Orban in Hungary. I suspect that Erdogan could be very happy with what's going on in India as Modi forces his kind of Hindu fundamentalism upon India, although he will also lose. And I do think that obviously the democracy in Russia is extremely thin, but there is still some democracy in Turkey, and I do think that Erdogan will not survive for very long, and I doubt if he's got an heir apparent. I doubt if he's got a successor. He's clearly an adept politician. He's clearly got a huge following. I suspect that, he's not immortal. I suspect that particularly when he dies, things might change. But I also think that it is quite possible, and we did see in Turkey a brief period when an alliance did reduce his representation in parliament. So I am cautiously hopeful that the Turkish people will come to their senses and will kick him out democratically. So I worry, it troubles me very deeply that so many people are locked up in prison, that they're being subjected to a bogus judicial process, that they're not going to get a fair trial, that they will be locked up. I find that extremely personally troubling and politically extremely offensive. But I'm a huge believer in the resilience and the courage and the energy and the intelligence of ordinary people. And I think that will prevail. I think it's passed one very important litmus test, which is that it has maintained its integrity, it's maintained its beliefs, it's maintained its peaceful democratic activities in the countries in which it's located. And I've had the good fortune, for instance, to go and to a conference with your colleagues and friends in Brazil, and met the Dialogue Society equivalent in Brazil, and it struck me, just like the London and the other cities in Leeds who have dialogue societies, it struck me in exactly the same way of people who can and will hold themselves together. And I think that's an important litmus test, that there's no sense that you're defeated, there's no sense that this is losing its spiritual and its social identity. It's past that litmus test. If I was to have a slightly more critical view, I think that it is, and I'll modify this in a moment, but in a nutshell, I think that it could perhaps have been a little bit more politically vociferous. Now, I modify that by saying that I think its communications are excellent. So when I have an email newsletter, or I have other forms of written material from the movement, I think that is very well written, it's very well researched, it's very authoritative, and I think it keeps the message in circulation. But I think that in the kinds of democracies where Hizmet is now located across the world, I think it could perhaps be a little bit more politically assertive by lobbying a bit harder for its voice to be heard within each of those countries. And I know that there is dialogue with sympathetic politicians in each of those countries, but I perhaps would push a bit harder on that, and I would push for perhaps more alliances with other supportive organizations, both NGOs and with democratic, progressive political groups in each of those countries. I'd also, and I know that this is tried, so I'm not, I'm not saying anything new here. I'd also support more efforts, if it can be achieved, with influencing other Muslims in each of those countries. And I know that there are, that your tradition is regarded by some more, for want of a better word, fundamentalist Muslims as heretical. So I know that there's a huge mountain to climb there, and I'm not suggesting that you can necessarily do that. But I do think that there could be more alliances with social groups that have got political or charitable intent. I've never had any moments when I thought, oh, maybe this movement isn't what it says it is. I've always thought that what I read and what is explained to me, read about Hizmet and what is explained to me by Hizmet supporters, is manifested in what I then see happening around me. So I really don't have any reservations about being convinced of the integrity and the mission and the genuineness of the professed mission of Hizmet. So no, I think, and I've had this discussion with Ozcan and the other friends in the Dialogue Society in London, and I think it's been taken on board. I think there is an issue of transparency, and I think that's pretty well addressed. And I think it's pretty understandable that an organization that has been so suppressed initially by the Kamalites and then more latterly by so-called Muslims running the government, a movement that has had such a rough time in its history, I can understand why it has some reasons for keeping quite a lot of its affairs under wraps. But I think in Britain in particular, that's been well addressed, and I remain as supportive today as I was right at the beginning. My message for Hizmet people is stay with it. Somehow protect yourselves from these vicious forces that are being arranged against you, particularly in Turkey, but also across the world. Stick with your beliefs, stick with your democratic and progressive methods of operation, and continue to struggle with your allies and with your friends for a better world for all of us, with your open-mindedness, with your dialogic approach, and with your peaceful and charming, intellectually informed conversations.